Right, good afternoon, everybody. We've saved the best till last, in the shape of General Jim Hockenhull. So I want to just put something in the room at the beginning, which is there's a massive power imbalance in this conversation. I left the army as a captain, almost the most junior rank you can have. And you're what, 4-star general? Yeah.
Apparently.
So just bear that in mind as we go forward, and I don't quite nail it. That's what's going on here. But Jim and I also have a number of things in common, which I hope will propel the conversation. First of all, we're both intelligence officers, which I think produces a particular mindset. Some would call subversiveness, others would call creativity, but we've got that thing, and we have worked together. But also, more pertinently, I think we both have a strong belief that the capabilities that our country and our allies need to secure our security and our defence need to be optimised for the next war, not the last war. And as I understand it, that's your job, right?
Yep.
But perhaps kind of in your own words, Jim, what is it that you're doing now in defence, and what brought you there?
Okay, well, thanks, Alex. Hi, I'm Jim. Nice to see you all. I run a thing called Strategic Command, which basically are the military capabilities that you don't usually see, or we intend that you can't see. I would see them as the crown jewels of defence. Heads of the Army, Navy and Air Force have got other views, but other views are available even if they're not correct. So I look after Defence's capacity to mount operations, so the Permanent Joint Headquarters, which runs our global operations. I look after the Special Forces, Defence Intelligence, the National Cyber Force, in partnership with GCHQ. But I also look
MI6, by the way.
and MI6, and DSTL, and some other people as well. I also look after defence education. I look after our overseas bases and our global defence network, logistics and support, and the Defence Medical Services. And it's about 30,000 people. And we're there to really drive integration across defence, to support campaigning, and particularly to lead the cyber and electromagnetic domain and drive that into the heart of defence's operations. And with the education element, it's about teaching ourselves and learning for the future as well. So it kind of hangs together as a set of capabilities, which is there really to help operationalise and modernise defence at the same time.
Did you volunteer for this job?
So I was very happy as the Chief of Defence Intelligence in a job that I thought I knew what I was doing in, although other opinions are available. And I was offered this opportunity, and I, for some reason that I can't quite remember, I said yes, I would do it. But it's brilliant, but complicated, I think.
Yeah, sounds complicated, but I suspect there's some high-level principles, knowing you, that run through it that are consistent. Let's just start perhaps with a very simple question. So we in this community have a conception of what cyber is. I suspect yours might be a little bit different. What does cyber mean in a defence context?
So firstly, when I talk about cyber and the electromagnetic domain. So I don't talk in terms just solely of kind of networks and data, whether that be in terms of protecting and securing those networks and data, or indeed interfering with the networks and data of our adversaries, and also serious organised crime and some others. When I talk about it, it's about everything in defence, because every network, every data centre, every weapon system, every platform has a cyber and electromagnetic dependency. They've all got a radio, or they've all got a computer, they've all got processing, they've all got connection, and therefore all of those are places that we need to secure. They're also all got inherent vulnerabilities. But also the cyber electronic domain is an opportunity to gain advantage over adversaries as well. So perhaps, unlike most who are looking mainly at at securing the cyber domain. Actually, we're looking to use the cyber domain to actually project our capability and to provide advantage, which may be solely at times in the cyber domain. It may be the cyber domain and information operations, but most usually we'd look to combine cyber operations with maneuver, with kinetics, with everything else that we do in defense. And that way you get a sort of a compound effect rather than a solo effect.
You should have been at the ransomware session, which was great, but it was posited that maybe we needed a more offensive approach to dealing with ransomware operators. But perhaps we'll come on to that in a moment. So look, Ukraine. So Ukraine. My last day in government, I was given like half an hour in the NSC to say what I really thought. And what I really thought was that ultimately we would be kept safe by a superior rate of technology innovation over our opponents, that in a hybrid world there was a risk that we'd lose a world before it even began. That we had to look at warfare in this new dimension. And then I was made to look rather stupid by a very 1914 style war starting up in Eastern Europe, which appears to be determined by the quantity of artillery shells available. So in a sense, it kind of confronts, I think, where we all thought this was going. What's your explanation of all of this? What are the sort of future-facing lessons that you're drawing from what is happening in Ukraine?
So I think in one sense you can look at the conflict and see that it appears as an attritional conflict, and you see social media coverage of people being attacked in trenches and armoured vehicles moving around the countryside. But there is, in terms of lessons from Ukraine, there's an industry in lessons in Ukraine, both inside defence and more broadly. And if you squint hard enough, you can learn any lesson you want from the conflict in Ukraine, and many people are. My sense is that the thing which has particularly sustained the Ukrainians, in addition to the kind of their own heroism and bravery and the supply of Western support, has been their ability to adapt and to innovate. And they've been really quite remarkable at the way in which they've adapted. They secured their national data very early on. They were helped by some Western companies in terms of being able to kind of secure their ability to govern. But then, in terms of the fight, they've been remarkable. The ability to take commercially available platforms and use those in really innovative and clever ways to provide advantage has been really significant. One thing we have seen, though, is that it's a campaign which looks traditional, but there's an awful lot of other things going on. So the Russians are using very, very widespread and high-quality electronic warfare capabilities, which has the ability to disrupt quite a lot of conventional capabilities. So there's a need to recognize we need to harden those capabilities to be able to work in a denied environment. Sometimes that takes quite a lot of innovation about how you are able to either get around, get through, and fight through those disruption which comes, but also the way in which the Ukrainians, together with some Western support, have been able to be really smart in their use of information operations, the way in which they've been able to strike deep against Russian targets. The fact that the Ukrainians are able to effectively sink a submarine whilst they don't really have a navy is really quite remarkable. And doing that through quite a complex attack, but blowing a hole in the side of a Kilo-class submarine, which will put it out of action for a very long time. Noting, of course, that because of the restrictions on the Bosphorus and being able to bring other vessels, particularly military vessels, into the Black Sea means it's gone out of the conflict for a significant period. Those sorts of things I think are really quite remarkable. So on the surface, it's an attritional struggle, and it's about who's got how much artillery, and you can kind of measure with a tape measure sometimes how much terrain is being taken. But actually, the way in which this conflict gets unlocked is through adaptive technology, the use of information, really smart application of being able to target. The fact that the Ukrainians have set up a network where they can crowdsource missile data by individuals taking photographs with their iPhone and sending that photograph in, which can then be analysed to track the assessed trajectory of the missile from a photo taken by an individual, which then provides warning in depth because you can work out where that missile is likely to be aimed towards. It's remarkable the way in which they've kind of adapted, I think.
So are you feeling from your perch at the top of a very large hierarchy a little bit over-centralised then? What are the lessons we're learning from this?
So yeah, I think so. There's always a tension, I think, about how you are organised and how you operate, and it's long been said, I think, of any military. It's said of the British military, perhaps as much as anyone else, that we're really, really good on operations, but we're not quite so good in barracks. And there's something, when we go on operations, the imperative means, I think, there's a real clarity of mind over what needs to be achieved. So in our deployable force, we need to kind of we need to empower them and give them freedom to be imaginative and change. And I think we're quite good at that. But in our kind of routine activity, we've got to flatten, we've got to work differently in our home base. And in some ways, we're kind of restricted on the basis we have a rank structure which is designed to be effective on the battlefield, and then we bring that into the business space and we think we've just got too many layers. Well, of course we have, because we've got about 13 different ranks. I've been through most of them, and at some you add value, you certainly do on operations, but in the home base we've got to flatten that down. What that also means, I think, is we've got to have a different set of relationships with partners, and Ukraine, I think, is showing us that the world has changed. I think we've known this for a long time, that innovation is happening at a far more rapid pace outside of the public sector and outside of defence. And how do we harness that in a way which works for us, but also works for the partners we need to work with? And that means, I think, we've got to change quite significantly about how we structure that engagement. And that requires us to be kind of smarter, flatter, and recognise that our cycle of refresh is going to be kind of tenfold compared to what it is at the moment, probably more so. I think there's also something about the future is kind of software defined rather than hardware defined, and defence will take a little bit of a while to kind of get to that, because it has big programs that it puts billions of pounds into, and actually what we need to do is recognise that our advantage isn't necessarily in the metal. Our advantage is in, I think, the higher technology in the minds of our people.
It seems you do need a war to really ram that lesson home. Well, let's hope we can do it in advance, but I think you certainly take that from Ukraine. So look, I mean, in cyber-wise in Ukraine, it seems from the outside like the Russians have actually been pretty ineffective in taking down networks of any scale, and have concluded it's much easier, sadly, to just drop a Shahed drone on a transformer. Have we just been? Has the Ukrainians just been lucky, or is it down to the sort of quality of the support they've had? What's been the secret sauce there, or is it that the Russians just haven't really, because they thought this war was going to last for 2 weeks, haven't really got the infrastructure in place to have the effect they might desire?
So we need to remember. I mean, I was in Kyiv very recently, and many of the people I spoke to took great pains to remind me that the war's been going on a very long time. It didn't start on the 22nd of February, but they've been preparing it since the end of the 2014 conflict. And they'd done some smart things about how they'd hardened. They had some very, very good partners in helping secure some of the civilian infrastructure. And in cyber terms, it's kind of, the story that cyber's the dog that didn't bark isn't really quite true. The Russians tried early on with some really significant cyber attacks against Ukraine, particularly into Kyiv. But the Ukrainians were well prepared. They'd thought about their resilience. They'd thought about redundancy, and they were able to fight in a way that I think surprised the Russians. Part of that, I think, is where they'd received quite a lot of Western support in changing their military from 2014 through to 2022. So cyber in the kind of the niche element of cyber of trying to take down sort of networks and really go after large data repositories, the Russians haven't been as effective as perhaps we might have thought. But in the electromagnetic element of the cyber domain, they've been really powerful. And it's a traditional thing. I mean, I joined the army during the Cold War. I was only 7 when I joined. That was a very early starter. That would also explain my performance at Sandhurst, where if Alex and I both got our Sandhurst reports out, I think there'd be lots of questions asked about both of us.
We're late developers, Jim, don't we?
Exactly, and I'm waiting for that to happen for me. So, but there's something I think around the kind of the Russians have always thought about how you disrupt in using electronic warfare at scale, and that's been a real feature of how they've been able to provide kind of greater protection. And some of that protection is kind of blunting some of the Ukrainian capability.
I mean, I think they were using Ukraine as a sort of test range from 2014, and they accidentally hardened their own target. But they also produced a load of capabilities that then leaked into the private sector and are a nightmare for our audience. Just on the blood-curdling threats that Putin issues, he hasn't used his cyber capabilities, his offensive cyber capabilities at all outside Ukraine. Was that expected?
So I mean, the Russians have a doctrine of kind of local, regional, and global conflict, and it's been clear, I think, since the start of the conflict that Russia has wanted to treat this as a local conflict. Indeed, they call it a special military operation, and I think they recognise the risks of kind of expanding the conflict. Of course, rather unfortunately for the Russian determination to keep it local, I think they went into the conflict with kind of 3 big ideas for Russia, or Putin's big ideas. One was for Russia to be a global power, one was to dominate the near abroad, and the third was to secure his own power. Yeah. Well, his secure his own power is kind of okay-ish at the moment. He hasn't secured his near abroad. In fact, if anything, he's changed that significantly with the accession of countries into NATO. So he's now, his near abroad is now more dominated by NATO, and his ability to reach more broadly, I think, is very limited. And what, of course, that does is it starts to, as the conflict goes forward, we haven't seen the broadening of the conflict from being a local conflict yet. You could construct arguments that there are scenarios in which that might happen, but I think pretty much since February 22, we've always lots of talk about Russian escalation, but actually the escalations they have done have been largely to be able to stay in the fight. So I think it's kind of contained to that local conflict.
And we've all been 6-year-olds in the playground, every single one of us, and we know what happens when you respond to intimidation threats. They get worse. And I personally, we all predicted that the war would happen. You guys were completely on the money. I think we predicted less how rubbish the Russians would be. Right, tell me about the National Cyber Force, which MI6 is a founding member, which you steward with GCHQ, which is a fascinating concept with rather sort of lurid expectations attached to it, death rays and all that stuff. But where the sort of mission statement that just came out dwelt on much less glamorous stuff about the cognitive space and the information war. Bit of a disappointment. We'd like some death ray stuff as well, if that's all right. But what now do you see? What potential does the National Cyber Force hold? How do you think it will evolve?
So in its kind of founding form, it really is trying to bring together the kind of the best of our national security community. The kind of the organizational planning capability of the military, the kind of the technical know-how of GCHQ, the cunning
of us. Yeah.
of MI6, and also others across the national security community, and trying to sort of pull that alchemy together. Other nations have decided to have a military cyber command, We've adopted a different approach, and I think it's about trying to generate a capability which is able to range from serious organized crime, child online sexual exploitation, crime verging into counterterrorism, all the way through to military operations, and through those military operations from sort of crisis all the way through to a warfighting capability. And I think it's really exciting because actually we have people that are ranging across those different mission sets, that are gaining experience against some targets which they're then able to bring to others. And by adopting a single organization, I think we get an efficiency out of our investment, which is significant. But we also get an effectiveness out of how we're doing this. And the work that we do against serious organized crime, is, although you may not, as you were, I understand, talking earlier about against ransomware, you may not have necessarily the means or the authority, or maybe you've got the means but not the authority to go after them at range. But of course, that is a national mission to provide a secure environment for people to be able to prosper. Into the longer term, I think we see the networking of national cyber force operations, which we're learning how to integrate them into wider police operations, wider intelligence operations, wider military operations. I think we'll find that that's much more embedded and becomes a much more common thing. And the primer that was published earlier in the year, I think, is very good. It did very much concentrate on cognitive effect. That's right up to a point. Of course, there are a range of other ways in which you can use your offensive cyber capability, and I think we should recognise that the threats that we face, our adversaries have a range of asymmetric advantages. Not having to play by the rule of law, not having to have any respect for norms and standards. And that often constrains our ability to be able to respond. And I think we need to find our own asymmetry against our adversaries. And I think the National Cyber Force provides one of those methods of asymmetry. I'm sure in your time in MI6 was approaching that as trying to be asymmetric. UK Special Forces provide an asymmetric edge. So there's something around seeing how we can, if we're limited and constrained in some ways, how can we leverage that advantage? And that, I think, it really takes us into the technology partnership that we want to run between the National Cyber Force and the technology industry. But that's going to also apply, I think, into wider defence as well.
Yeah, we could talk about that. I mean, I think a thing that really defined my career, and I was convinced, as I think you are, that to prevail, we have to have this technology on our side, not on that of our opponents. And I think for a long time, tech and the national security community talked past each other, and Snowden didn't help, obviously. That was sort of ground zero. But over time, I saw this relationship mature and a real understanding on the part of everyone that we needed to, everyone has a stake in the future of our liberal democracy. And I'd be interested to hear what it looks like now, Jim, in terms of, particularly given what we've learned in Ukraine, the partnership piece. How do we generate the new capabilities? How do we capture the new skills in a way that can be brought to bear against this mission, given the quality of what's going on more broadly?
Yeah. So I think it is changing and has changed a little bit, but we haven't quite, I think, moved the boundary of what we think of being people in national security. And I think we need to kind of move the boundary so that a lot more of our technology partners see themselves as being inside the boundary of national security. Now, they may also they'll have things they're doing outside as well, but I think we need to recognize that we're national security partners, because I think we're going to have to move, instead of saying we want you to provide technology to be additive to what we do, actually we need to bring you inside to provide core elements of national security upon which we're going to have to rely on partners to deliver. And if we're relying upon it, then it needs to be a sort of a partnership of kind of true bond rather than one of what does the contract say?
And you can give them the problem rather than the solution at that point.
And I think that's exactly right. And it may well be. I was talking with Christopher last night about how do we get around the idea of kind of national security vetting, and we need to find solutions to these things. That we can't say the only way you can work on our most complex problems is to spend a year getting all of your staff cleared to the right level. We've got to find ways of finding a different mode of engagement, and I think that's going to require all in government, particularly in defence, to really adjust our approach and be much more open. I think it's also going to need industry to operate a slightly different model as well. So we probably need to get into the idea of, I'd be keen to develop some technology frameworks with technology companies in order to say, look, let's be in the framework. Let's and that may well in that framework, it may well be that there's a minimum guarantee of a scale of partnership, but actually there's opportunity into and easy to bid into new contracts, because us specifying requirements for something that we're not going to get for 5 or 10 years is pointless. They will undoubtedly be wrong, and what we're tending to get is kind of yesterday's technology tomorrow, but at kind of 4 times the price, and that's often for it's through the system that we created, but also the way in which we work. And I think we've got to be far more iterative. It's got to be a much kind of higher trust environment. And I'm a kind of big believer in kind of trust and verify. So, I'll trust people until they prove me that I shouldn't trust them, and then we'll perhaps, have a different conversation. But there's a real need, I think, to change the nature of the partnership, which is easily said, and I'd be really keen kind of subsequently with people in the audience, in order to kind of have some detailed conversations as to kind of how we can make that work. And we need to be able to make it work for small and medium-sized enterprises, because just going to big primes adds overhead and complexity and time, and doesn't usually necessarily in this field give us what we need.
Can we just talk about open source? It's a big part of what happens at Recorded Future. I find it very beguiling. I have a prejudice, I suppose, that in the intelligence world, we put the secrets in the middle and then we look for open source to sort of garnish those things. But how sensible would it be just to invert that model? Cheaper and crucially much easier to share, because you don't have all the secrecy stuff. You steward amongst your capabilities this gigantic open source capability. What's the future in government? I mean, is there a risk that you over-centralize this and stifle innovation? Or is it actually a sort of capability that needs to be nurtured, or how does it look to you?
So I'm slightly fearful when government says there are all these great things going on, let's put it all in one place, because that usually means kind of bureaucracy and stifling innovation. Equally, there's a risk of kind of you let 1,000 flowers bloom and they all die off. So to me, there's something about how we kind of loosely couple what's going on around defence. I mean, there's one open source company who I know have got about 14 different contracts. It's not Recorded Future. I know I've got 14 different contracts across UK government. We pay 14 different price points for the same information. And we have 14 different contract negotiations with that company. I mean,
a clever person if you're in the room.
So
hopefully the days of that are numbered.
So we're trying to kind of knock those things down. But I absolutely agree. I think that the power of kind of publicly available information, including commercial satellite, which has been really powerful in the context of Ukraine, as well as information which is available through a variety of sources, even down to things like the fact that CCTV is often streamed that you can go off and buy quite easily. There's a whole range of open source tools, and I'm of the opinion that about 80%, maybe more, of what historically we've thought of as being in the kind of secret intelligence game, I think you can generate that through open source capability. But what we've not done is we've not said, we've not turned that into reality of saying, okay, well, in which case, where's the scale of investment that shows you that change? Yeah. Now, even at 80-20, the 20% which is truly secret will still be, in relative terms, very expensive, but we haven't yet really kind of systematized our approach. What we also need to do is recognize that open source is a big opportunity to do what we were talking about earlier, which is that partnering. So if it's going to be open source analysis, I don't need to employ lots of people in defense to go and do all that work. Actually, what I need is some trusted partners who can do that work and provide it to me. On a commercial satellite provider, I don't want them to send me thousands of pictures, or images, I suppose I should call them. What I do want is I want them to send me the one when something's changed. And I want them to do the analytics that say, hey, this is the one that's changed, which I can then give to my well-trained analyst who can then add value to what's going on. Maybe we then use that to queue some different top secret collections. So there's something about inverting the model that actually your top secret collection is being draped over an open source fabric and may in fact be tasked by your open source work. And quite a lot of that open source work I think can be done by commercial providers, not just giving us loads more data and images and everything else, but actually giving us product. And then that changes the nature of how we do work. But if we do that, of course, we've got to have a relationship where we know that provider is going to be there with us, providing that no matter what is happening. Yeah. And that, that means that it really does need to be a kind of national security partnership.
And I imagine when it comes to AI, these disciplines are multiplied, given where the skills lie.
Absolutely, and we've got a skills deficit. Our ability to recruit, retain, is magnified, perhaps even from the challenges that people face in kind of industry. I think we need to recognise that we're probably going to hold our people for shorter periods of time. We want to kind of intervene, get people early, offer them a kind of a degree whilst they're in service for our kind of soldiers, sailors and airmen. When they kind of leave us, perhaps at sort of 25, they're coming out with 7 years experience, qualification, the right sort of life skills, the right sort of approach to work, and then I hope to see them coming back out to work in kind of wider national security. But of course, I think we're in for where it's very easy to underestimate the change which is coming. I think the change which is coming is fundamental, and that fundamental is going to shift the sort of the experience that I've had through my career, where in order to understand, we've massed people on top of the available data. And I think that's going to change fundamentally, and we'll find that actually what we're looking to do, I think, is to move our analysts sort of up the value chain to the kind of high right of the graph, in order that they're adding the value that they can whilst investing in the capability which is providing the kind of the core analytics for us.
And if you're successful, there's a cool thing which you see in Israel, which is we stimulate an entire industry, an ecosystem of skill, which is to all our advantage. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Alex.